It's Ash from SuperVideos back for another video for The Walking Dead Dead City. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at some pretty interesting and intriguing details that were revealed about the Croat. Who was he and how was his life as an ex-savior? What were his connections to the saviors that were there and Negan himself? We're going to talk about all of that, and we're going to talk about a few theories as far as what his relationship with some of the Savior's lieutenants, particularly Simon, could have been like. So stay tuned, we'll be right back to break this down. Alright, as always, before we dive into it, smash the like button, subscribe to join our community, and press the bell to be notified when I upload on the channel. So of course, at this point, there's been several scenes with Negan telling the audience about who the Croat is, how he knows Negan, and why the Croat is looking for him. From what we've gathered so far, after the apocalypse, the Croat was surviving with his family. He went looking for supplies, and when he returned, he found his family butchered and eaten by other survivors. So the Croat lost his family in a very brutal and sadistic way. And that actually pushed him towards being a much darker character. But then, of course, after that, he took revenge for his family's deaths and killed the people responsible. And after he was sort of done with life, and the person that came and rescued him was none other than Negan, who actually took him in and provided shelter for him at his sanctuary. In fact, at some point, Negan and the Croat were so close that Negan called the Croat his brother. Now, at this point, what hasn't been confirmed is whether the Croat was one of Negan's lieutenants later on, or possibly a right-hand man like Simon, or whether he was just there as a very brutal soldier who could work for Negan and do his dirty work for him. But obviously, things took a turn for the worse when the Croat went against Negan's orders and basically butchered a Kingdomer scout, even though Negan had specifically told him to let them go. And it's important to note that it was a very young survivor, if not a kid. So that is something important to keep in mind. We'll come back to that. But after Negan finds out what happened, he tries to kill the Croat. He shoots him but misses, hence why the Croat is missing an ear. And then that's the last time Negan saw the Croat. But now, all of these years later, the Croat has found Negan and is basically looking to take revenge for what Negan did to him. Now, it's important to note a few interesting connections and similarities here. One of these has to do with Simon and Negan and their relationship. Obviously, in the third episode called People Are a Resource, we get a direct connective tissue between Negan's life as a savior and the Croat's life and how he runs his business. We do know that when Negan was in charge of the Saviors, something that was really important to him was the fact that people are a resource. He thought that keeping people alive is important because they are going to be providing for him. They are his resources. Something that Simon actually disagreed with on quite a few occasions. In fact, Negan and Simon butt heads a few times about that, and when Simon went against Negan's orders and against this principle of people are a resource, Negan got pretty pissed at him. Let's take it back to the Croat. Obviously, we know that the Croat killed one of the young Kingdomer scouts, even though Negan had specifically told him not to, because he believes that people are a resource. So in a way, the Croat butchered at least one person from the kingdom because he thought that was the best way for them to fall in line. And now with that, something really, really interesting is coming up as far as a similarity between the Croat and his life as a savior and Simon and his life as a savior. Because we know that Simon did something very, very similar. He went against Negan's orders and butchered all of the men at Oceanside, something that Negan gave him a pass on and forgave him for. But then, of course, we know that he did the same exact thing to the Scavengers and Jadis's group. He rolled in and killed everyone there, even though he was specifically told by Negan not to do that. And that was actually the beginning of the end for Simon, because that was the point in which Negan said, I'm done with Simon and I'm gonna eliminate him. The fact that the Croat did something very similar and Negan wasn't able to kill him brings up the possibility that Negan is gonna want to kill the Croat even all of these years later, because there's this grudge between them. So even if the Croat lets it go, and even if Maggie is able to get her son back, Negan might not let it go. And after everything is settled, he might go after the Croat himself. Something like that. But let's take a step back. Let's talk a little bit more about that principle. People are a resource. Well, what we know is that even though both the Croat and Negan are saying people are a resource in front of their people, none of them actually believe it. I mean, when it comes to the Croat, he did yell, people are a resource, when he had the marshal fight off walkers to survive. So he didn't treat the marshal as a resource. That kind of shows you the contradiction. Similarly, he did the same thing with his chef. He killed his chef because the food that he'd provided was rotten. Now, this reminded me a lot of Negan and his doctor. Again, much like the Croat, Negan puts this front where he says people are a resource, but when it comes to it, sometimes he doesn't necessarily believe in that principle, because after he initially wanted to burn the doctor's face, he changed his mind and actually killed the doctor, much like the Croat killed his chef. So we're beginning to see a lot of similarities between not only the Croat and Negan being the leaders of the saviors, let's call them, the Croat saviors and Negan's saviors, but also between the Croat and Simon. So that kind of makes you wonder what would have happened if Simon killed Negan instead. Simon might have turned the sanctuary into how the Croat is running his sanctuary. Something interesting that I thought that needs to be talked about more, but it's not. But something that's definitely super interesting and intriguing. But speaking of the Croat and his sanctuary, he actually created his very own sanctuary in New York City. We know that the Madison Square Garden in New York City has actually turned into the Croat's sanctuary, much like Negan had the factory as his sanctuary. So again, a lot of similarities in terms of how the Croat is running his settlement. It's extremely interesting because the Croat engages with his people, puts on a show for them, the same exact way that Negan did. It's almost identical. He just doesn't have Negan's charisma. That's the only difference. But it's definitely super interesting that looking at it from afar, the Croat is kind of replicating what Negan had and trying to be a Negan, which is super interesting. He admires Negan, but he wants to take revenge because of what Negan did to him. Maybe because of what Negan did to him, that pushed him to become someone like a Negan, to defeat him. So that's another perspective to look at things as well. But all of that brings us to this question. Where is the Croat story going to go from here? What's going to happen with him and Negan? It's entirely possible that we might actually see a showdown between the Croat and Negan. And we might actually see a scene very similar to the scene between Negan and Simon, where they actually fight to the death. And of course, if we're being cliche with it, it's going to go down the same way. Negan will defeat and kill the Croat. And at that point, they could either have him maybe run the Croats' sanctuary, but the right way, or they go with things a little differently and less cliche. But the alternative is either after Negan kills the Croat, what they end up doing is something along the lines of the Croats' saviors are gonna have none of what Negan did, and they're gonna come after him. But the other way that it could go, the way that it's least cliche, is the opposite. So instead of having Negan kill the Croat like he killed Simon, we could see the Croat killing Negan. And get this, Maggie coming after the Croat and killing him to take revenge for Negan's death. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen in season 1. It might not happen in season 1, but I feel like long term, that might be an intriguing and interesting direction for them to go as far as bringing the Negan and Maggie story to a conclusion. Imagine how badass it would be for Maggie to kill the Croat in a similar fashion to how Negan killed Simon. That would be super interesting. With all of that, I'm definitely intrigued to know your thoughts and opinions, so share that in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this, smash the like button, subscribe to join our community, and press the bell to be notified when I upload on the channel. That's it for this video. See you next time for another super video.